Well, welcome to all of you. I was not here last week. Of course, you knew that because I was up north at a Nekema, an Episcopal summer chapel that they let me preach at and stay in their cottage. So Philip told me that there's not a darn thing I need to say about him because it was all said already. All that I just want to say, he's the renegade Methodist preacher because he hung out with us Episcopalians for a lot of time. And as was mentioned, I have the microphone. You're not to ask questions or make comments until the very end. And I have the microphone. I'm not going to let you get to it. So I'm going to turn it over to Philip.
There, I think I have it right side up.
Yeah,
time.
when you put it over the ears.
There we go.
Perfect. We can
And
hear you well.
those of you who were here last week know that I did allow someone to ask a question in the midst, but I don't overly encourage it. If you think you have some burning point that you want to make, feel free, as long as you know that I may decide whether that's something we should get into now or not. It could very well be. Whatever you do, don't lose your question. Make note of it. And if you're still wondering about it afterwards, and ask it when the microphone is coming up, or even after class, if you don't think it applies that much, but you're still interested in. Remember that part of my purpose is to jump into this world of biblical scholarship. David introduced me as a preacher, and I let you know yesterday I was the preacher. I'm leaving on that side of the room, and the academic study of the Bible is over here, which I enjoy as well. But I have not spent as much time over there. David knows that it's easy to leave the tools that you learn in seminary back there because they don't all apply to over here. But they are fun tools to use. And I like this part of the world of the Bible is just equal, and I won't evaluate them. I like them both. But we're dealing over here. So you can't hold me responsible to being a preacher and being safe all the time and all of those things. Well, last week, what we did is looked at one particular story. One woman who on the surface of it looks very, very much like a minor character. In fact, she is considered a minor character in the gospel. Anonymous, we don't know anything about her. And yet we saw how she, in the role of this gospel, plays a very, very strategic part. She is very critical. She is the most important, in my thinking, in my thesis, she is the most important character in the Bible because she, I will contend, will help us understand the most dramatic puzzle of the Gospel of Mark, and that's its abrupt ending at verse 8 in chapter 6. However, you can't base a thesis on one character, on one story. In this case, the story of the woman who anoints Jesus after he gets to Jerusalem before his crucifixion. And so what we're doing today is placing her in the context of the whole gospel and looking particularly at the role of women in that gospel. So hopefully you had a chance to read through the gospel in one setting before now. And we will get to those, but to get to that examination of the women in the gospel. But first, I do want to. But we're not advancing here. Susan, is there
Just hover your mouse on the screen and click it once, and that will make the PowerPoint come alive.
There we go. Oh, okay, very good. This is what you should have been looking at when I was saying that last bit about what we're going to be doing today. We're looking at the narrative of the gospel and the role of women in it. Just a broad overview. Most people now believe that Mark was the first gospel. It wasn't always the case that we felt that, but ever since we decided it took on new importance. And there has been an explosion in the study of the Gospel of Mark, whereas first it was written off as not as important. It almost didn't make it into the canon. As the first gospel, then, it creates a new literary form. There were things that get called biographies of charismatic figures in the first century. But the Gospels, particularly Mark's, do not fit it exactly. So they weren't following a pattern exactly available to them from other creators of literature. And that's why it has that unique title of gospel. You'll find out where we get that word gospel in a moment. And it was anonymously written. The name Mark was not attached to it for at least 100 years. And people have tried to identify particular John Mark, but nothing conclusively. It was written about 70 AD. And we won't get into how that's discovered exactly. And the variations of thought on that. But that means that it was roughly 40 years after Jesus. The first thing that we have in our hands that was written about Jesus. We know things existed. People told stories about Jesus. And we guess that there were some written collections of some of these stories, but this is the first. One of the reasons that Mark was dismissed so early on is that the Gospel of Mark has very crude Koine Greek. I haven't checked this out, but my suspicion is that whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark did not grow up speaking Greek. So it's a new language. The grammar is not good. And so people have kind of disparaged it in that sense. However, once we took it seriously and started looking at it, what it was, we noticed that there is great literary skill involved in the compilation of this gospel. And that skill takes place mostly in the arrangement of the stories. You can divide the gospel into segments, very brief segments, events that happen, a miracle that takes place, or an encounter between two people, between Jesus and somebody else, or something that Jesus says, like a parable. You can divide those all up, and instead of outlining, I say the best thing to do with the gospel is to line it out and take all those things and put them side by side. And when you do, you see connections between them, connections between the immediately preceding episode, the immediate episode afterward, and also down the road. You can say, oh, this section has one of these stories, so does this section. So you see nice little patterns there, and you say, hey, somebody was using great skill. We know that the writers of the gospel, the compilers of these stories, they didn't just make this up. The gospels aren't fiction in that sense. They existed as stories that were told, and those stories have different histories, and we try to get at those histories, but we can't always prove anything for sure. But what we know is that the gospel writers did not act as slaves to some historical chronology. They differ. The gospel writers feel completely free in differing in their chronology. to diverge. And so we see that they have arranged their materials in a way for some purpose and with some great skill in how we encounter a story, a narrative, so that it hangs together, it moves somewhere. And Mark is very good at moving us along. He didn't always use the right Greek word, but he used that Greek word "and" very often. And so we're not, very seldom are we tempted to sit down. And it's like somebody has compared Mark to a middle school storyteller. And then, you know, we keep moving. And then also, we study Mark. This explosion in Mark and studies has happened because as the first gospel, then we can see how Mark set the pattern for the others. So that Matthew and Luke apparently had Mark available to them, and they followed Mark's pattern. For the most part, they follow Mark's pattern. And then they had other materials that they work into their gospels that Mark may not have had access to, or at least chose not to use. Like you noticed and you read through that, Mark chose to start with the baptism of Jesus. You know, nothing about anything earlier in his life was significant. This is the title of the gospel. It's right at the beginning. It's the first sentence, or a sentence fragment in English. In other words, Gospel of Mark is not the title. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God, is the title. And I start there because it contains one of the two themes I want to call attention to. I'm only going to call attention to two themes, because they're pretty widely accepted by everybody as a agreed upon central theme of this gospel. And also because they help us look at the structure. We're going to be placing the women in the gospel into this structure that the themes provide for us. Good news, that's the word gospel there, evangelion. It was not new. It was used broadly for good news, but it has become identified now with gospels, thanks to Mark. Good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. One of the themes that we'll find that is important in this gospel is the identity of Jesus. Who exactly was Jesus? Right from the start, our author wants to identify for us, the reader or the hearer, since this was first heard before by most people instead of read, to know that Jesus is the Christ. In other words, the Christ is the Messiah word there. The word we learned last week, the one who has oil poured on his head, the one who's been anointed. That's the word, what the word Messiah or Christ means. And then Son of God, which in the Bible, both Christ and the Bible have very fluid definitions, more so Christ than Son of God, but like David was called Son of God and others. Anyway, so this first theme, the identity of Jesus. Who do people say that I am? Jesus actually asks. That first arrow there on the left is the title. So we know the identity of Jesus, at least in name. Immediately after that, that gets confirmed to Jesus. If Jesus didn't know already, Jesus knows at his baptism that he is God's son. And that's a theological question. We don't have to deal with that. Narratively, that's established at the beginning, the idea of Jesus as God's son, right at the beginning through the baptism. That voice comes to Jesus, not to the people around. Then right at the end of the arrow on the furthest on the right, the centurion, Roman centurion, looks up at Jesus on the cross and says, truly, this man was Son of God. You notice I left out the article. That's not a typo, because the Greek here does not have an article. So we don't know for sure whether the centurion was referring to Jesus as the Son of God, as Mark understands Jesus to be, or just, the Romans considered their emperors as sons of God. Whether just another Jesus is a son of God or the Son of God, we don't know for sure. Most people suspect the Roman means a son of God. But Mark could be wanting to suggest, at least allow room for us to believe that this is a confirmation of Jesus as the Son of God. Then the other part of Jesus's identity that we learned in the title was the Christ. And that gets introduced right smack in the middle, in an overt way. When Jesus asks this question, who do people say that I am? And after the disciples run through some of the things that people are talking about, Peter says, you are the Christ. And that sounds very monumental. For Mark, it's monumental. For Mark, at least, it's monumental in another way, because immediately afterwards, Jesus talks about the fact that he's going to suffer and die when he gets to Jerusalem, and Peter rebukes him. That word rebuke means to, like, exercise that you've got a demon. Get rid of that demon, Jesus. You're thinking wrong. And Jesus turns around and rebukes Peter. And that's where he says, get behind me, Satan. So we have something very interesting about the identity of Jesus. Jesus and Peter are not in agreement. We're going to see how that plays out a little bit. At least I want you to know that that happens right in the middle of the gospel. Then later on in chapter 1, just 14 verses, this is the 15th verse, right shortly after the baptism, Jesus makes this pronouncement: the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is near. Repent and believe in the good news. Most people agree that the kingdom that Jesus is preaching is a central theme, and it's of a critical importance. And it's something we should take with us throughout our study of the gospel. What is this kingdom that Jesus is preaching? We see it as something Jesus presents as in opposition to the kingdom of the world. So Jesus is going to be a radical figure because he is presenting something that goes against what is observable in the world. That could be what the Romans are doing. The Roman Empire is part of that kingdom of the world that Jesus is opposing. And we'll see it possibly involving the religious leaders of the day that Jesus opposes, as they are acting as if they are part of the kingdom of the world. And right there in the middle of the gospel, Jesus accuses Peter. You are thinking not God's thoughts, but human thoughts. Peter has identified himself as belonging to that thinking, at least, like that kingdom of the world. So I left that arrow in. Jesus is preaching, I mentioned is controversial because of what he's doing. That first arrow there, that's at chapter 3, verse 6. We find an interesting segment of controversy stories in the beginning, very beginning of Mark, chapter 2, leading into chapter 3. And each one, we can see that Mark has allowed us to see a progression. It's getting more intense, this opposition to Jesus. So that by 3:6, by 3:6, we read about the plot to destroy Jesus. That's only at the beginning of the 3rd chapter of this gospel. So Jesus's radical nature, as well as his eventual doom, is signaled right from the start. It's not a nice story until we come to a bad ending. We know right away where things are going. Okay, and then at the time that Peter makes his proclamation, that's the first time Jesus announces his death. And that will take place in Jerusalem. That begins a journey that he takes his disciples on toward Jerusalem. And he will find out that he teaches them, along the way. But right there in the middle of the gospel already, that's where we head right toward the end. In between that series of controversy stories and some other things, we learn about the plot. There are 3 sections. That first one, the yellow one, we find, you may have noticed that Jesus tells very few parables in Mark. In Mark's gospel, Jesus doesn't do a whole lot of sitting people down and talking to them. There's no Sermon on the Mount or Sermon on the Plain, like Luke include. But there is a very brief section of parables, and they're grouped together there toward the beginning. And then we have 2 sections of healing and feeding stories. And by healing, I mean both physical healing and exorcisms, because in the first century, your physical health was very much connected to the spiritual world. So evil and demons, those were connected. We can assume that Jesus sees this realm of the demonic as part of this kingdom of the world that he is to oppose. And so by casting out these demons, he's paving the way for this kingdom that he's preaching. And feeding is a big miracle in all the Gospels. And what we see in Mark is that there's a series of healings and other miracles, including a feeding in Jewish territory. And then practically the same thing happens again, is mirrored in Gentile territory. There are similar healings, and there is another feeding of a crowd in Gentile territory. In the feeding in the Jewish territory, it's 5 loaves, and there are 12 baskets left over. 5 is symbolic of Judaism, as well as 12. They're very important numbers. We know that Mark is now into symbolism of the details. The healing story in the Gentile territory involves 4 loaves and 7 baskets left over. 4 and 7 are both very significant numbers representing universality, the non-Jewish world, the rest of the world. So that presents a nice little completeness in Jesus's Galilean ministry. It's addressed to both Jews and Gentiles, which was radical too. And then in the journey, after Jesus makes this statement, get behind me, Satan, to Peter, there are 3 major teaching sections, and it's a cycle. We see the same things in each time. It follows Jesus's pronouncement of his suffering and his death and his resurrection. And each time he lifts up characters that don't have power. Children, other outcasts. Jesus lifts up servants, an idea of serving others. Each time the disciples show their confusion and show their interest in having places of power, not understanding this message that Jesus is trying to say, that The answer is not going to Jerusalem and setting up our power structure, but it is to suffer and die for the sake of others. So there are 3 sections there that if you didn't notice them in your read through, you can go back and find them quite easily. And that's the kind of structure I want to look at the women in the gospel in. And these are the ones that are on my list to talk about. You can compare that if you made your own list. What I want to make sure, though, is that if you had other comments, other observations during your read through, make note of those. You know, even if you don't decide not to bring them up here in class, make note of those, because who knows, by the end, they may become important. And even if they aren't, they could be the important details that start you on a journey of biblical scholarship. So we are, because of the nature of how Mark's gospel is put together, we are following a method that's become very popular in Markan studies and other New Testament studies, and that's called narrative criticism. When I made my transition from studying English literature as an undergraduate to studying biblical literature as a graduate study, I was astounded by how complex things got. It seemed to me that back when we were studying English literature, you just studied what was there. You know, you were given tools depending upon what it was, you know, to use. Like if it was poetry, then you brought out your tools of scansion and looked at the rhythm and the meter and things like that. You looked at rhyme schemes like we used in the story of the woman who anoints Jesus last week, that kind of rhyme scheme that's there. But in the world of biblical criticism, they have all these categories of types of study of the Bible. Form criticism looks at each of those little incidents and tries to figure out where they come from and what their history was. How did they get into this written form? You know, what changes were made, you know, along the way. And then you have redaction criticism, which is more about how different authors use those things in their, you know, work. I won't get into it because it gets complex, and I still have not, after years and years of study, fully grasped what biblical scholar mean by some of these terms. Literary criticism we encountered in my early seminary days, and it didn't exactly fit necessarily what I had learned studying English. There were some people referring to literary criticism the same way I was used to, and that is what has become more popular these days. And it gets called mostly narrative criticism, though some people still use that word, literary criticism, narrative criticism. And the idea is that you treat it as a story. And you don't, at least at first, you don't worry about where this came from. You don't worry about what actually happened. What was the real event behind this story that we find in the gospel? We don't do a lot of comparisons between one gospel and another. We stick to this story. And that's what we did last week. And that's pretty much what we will do this week. Even narrative critics realize that they have to venture outside of that. But I think it's a good principle for anybody, whether you know it or not, to follow that narrative criticism style by looking at what you find. Don't worry about looking things up in a commentary. Give it a chance to sink into your brain. Notice how your brain and experience is reacting to this story, because that's important. Later, you may want to dig further, and you may want to look up a word in Greek and that kind of thing, or study how it relates in another gospel. But give it a chance to live, first of all, as we find it. So anything that you noted down, don't dismiss it, keep it in mind. If it doesn't resonate with what I'm saying, don't worry about that. Okay, so there's our structure that we gained from looking through the themes, the two major themes. And the first woman we encounter is Peter's mother-in-law. And that's still in the very first chapter. It's not the first healing that Jesus does, but it's the first woman Jesus encounters. And did you notice anything interesting about her? And I will repeat it if you want to. If you were reading this as a feminist, and I said I demur a little bit there because I don't know exactly how to define a feminist scholar. I've been reading a lot of them, but I still won't venture to call myself one. But if you're reading this as a feminist scholar, I think at least you would be tempted to say, okay, there we go. Right off the bat, we don't know this woman's name. We know about her in relationship to a man. We will find that throughout the gospel. That was very customary in the first century. Also, we find out that after Jesus heals her, and this takes place in a home, after Jesus heals her, she serves the disciples, Jesus and the disciples. Okay, another flag goes up. Okay, yeah, once you know, immediately she's got to start doing, women's work. Now, a couple of caveats. One, we will see how our gospel is concerned with elevating that status of servant. And in fact, one of the first biblical feminist scholars is Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, and she is on one of her books is on that reading list, calls attention to the fact that the word used for service here does not refer to menial tasks, but is that word that gets used for what eventually became the word deacon. So in our gospel, at least, the work that she does will be put in a positive light. Scholars sometimes say, well, it takes place in a house. That's where women belongs. And so that's okay for a woman to be lifted up in the house. Now, that's a thing to keep in the back of our mind. Others will say, maybe this miracle took place in a home because Jesus or our author wants to elevate the house and not see that as secondary. Anyway, anything else anybody wants to comment about Peter's mother-in-law? Then the next episode we find involving women, we have a healing of the daughter of Jairus. We don't meet her personally, but she is the object of Jesus's concern when Jairus, a religious leader, comes to him and says, my daughter is in bad shape. Can you come put your hands on her and heal her? I should open up my text. In case I want to look at any particular phrasing. And he eventually goes to the house, even after people have said, too late, don't bother the teacher anymore, she has died. Jesus insists on going anyway. To the wailers, the people have already started the mourning process. He says, why this commotion? Why all this crying? She is not dead, she is only sleeping. And he raises her to life, and we won't worry about at this point what that means. Was Jesus being serious when he said that she was not really dead? Or are there other reasons for placing it this way? However, before we find out what happens to her. Guess what? Mark has given us another one of those intercalations. I hope that you recognize this from our study of last week, that Mark loves to do this, place one story inside of another. And it happens here that we have a woman with a hemorrhage who encounters Jesus, makes her way to him. And you may remember how Jesus is aware of her because she reaches out and touches him, his garment. And Jesus says, "Who touched me?" To his disciples. And his disciples, they either are making a joke, "Who touched you?" You see this crowd pressing around. They're either in there for humor, or they're kind of acting sarcastically. We won't deal with them at the present moment. But there is immediately some dramatic tension because Jesus knows that he's been touched. This woman knows that Jesus knows that he's been touched. And a woman in her condition is unclean. She is not supposed to touch other people. She has broken it's a breach of conduct. She is not, that's not what an unclean person is not supposed, is to remove themselves from others. There's to be no contact, because then she makes the person she touches impure, religiously impure. And so there's this dramatic tension when Jesus says, "Who touched me?" What's going to happen? We can imagine her being fearful, and she is fearful, but she does not hide. In other words, she presents herself, and she tells her story. And Jesus says, "Your faith has made you well." So we have a model here in this woman of somebody who is bold, determined, and persistent. Do you remember how long she's been ill? She's not going to put up with it any longer. And she is going to break that barrier, take the risk, and Jesus recognized that as faith. We'll notice that Jesus does this often in Mark, and perhaps the other Gospels too, that faith is not something you have inside here. It's not something you believe. It's something you do. And she acts on her determination to be healed. In other words, Jesus is blessing this, the stepping over the line that she does instead of cursing it. So this is major, and some people lift her up as one of the first great models of faith in all the Gospels. She breached the purity law, and Jesus honored it as faith instead of cursing it. The other thing that Jesus does is call her daughter. Okay, so even his word for her is embracing a familiar relationship, a family relationship. She belongs to Jesus. Jesus belongs to her. And why is that word daughter significant in this context? Where is Jesus headed? To heal the daughter of Jairus, who gets called the apple of Jairus's eye. So a daughter who's very important to Jairus. Jesus is, in other words, by using this term for her, it's not belittling her as a little girl. Daughter could be an older person as well. Jesus is saying, this person is important to me. Potentially, Mark wants us to think this person is important to all of us. So then we eventually do get to the home of Jairus, where I mentioned there was a commotion because she has, in everybody's opinion, died, because when Jesus says she's only sleeping, they laugh at him. Jesus goes in to the child's room with the parents and three of the disciples, or at least two. And he says, well, he heals her. He says, Talitha cum, rise, get up. Little girl, calls her, I think he refers to her as a little girl. But when she gets up, the verb used is the same one as Jesus's resurrection, anastai. Okay, so it could be that Mark is wanting us to see a connection here between this woman, this girl, and his upcoming resurrection. In other words, she is a foreshadowing. Now, the interesting thing for us is, since we're looking at the role of women here, is that similarly, in John's gospel, Lazarus is discussed as, always referred to, as a preceding figure to Jesus's resurrection. The raising of Lazarus becomes a symbol in John's gospel for the resurrection. And everybody talks about that. I have heard very few people talk about this girl as a similar character preceding Jesus's, foreshadowing, preparing us for Jesus's resurrection. And you might make a social commentary about that. I don't know. I will leave that to you. And then we have kind of a different story, because it doesn't refer to, it doesn't apply, it doesn't include Jesus and the disciples themselves. It's Herodias, the story of Herodias, the wife of King Herod, who has taken John the Baptist into custody. Herodias had been married to Herod's brother. Okay, and John has called attention to that as sin. Taking a wife away from somebody else is sin. And however, Herodias's marriage to Herod has given her something that a lot of women don't have in the first century, and that's some power. She seems to be more upset about John than Herod himself actually does. The text allows us, to see a little bit of reluctance on Herod's part to do completely away with Jesus. We have another daughter involved. This is the daughter of Herod and Herodias. It could be that she's a symbol of their marriage, so she's important for that reason. But she dances. She is requested to dance at this party that Herod is throwing. It's an all-male party, apparently. And so a lot of questions have been raised about the nature of this dance and why she is called in to dance for them. This has some important gender issues that we're not going to get into, because I don't see them as directly applicable to our present study. But there is at least one feminist scholar who has taken this story and really done some intensive investigation into the gender relationships of that era, and how this story is very symbolic and recreates a lot of questions. If anyone wants to explore that further, come ask me for that, the name of that author. But I want to at least point out that they are the only females who have a negative role, or at least Herodias does. It's possible to see the daughter as simply a pawn. But at least Herodias has a negative role. And she is the only one in the gospel who has that negative role. And people have commented that it's interesting that she is also the only woman with power in the gospel. So could this story be influencing that theme of Jesus's identity and his effort or his values of the kingdom, where he wants to downplay power over others and uplift the power of serving others. And also, the story is a contrast because of its tone. I don't know about you, but I come to this story and reading through the gospel, and I just have to take a little bit more time. It's sad. And so you see how John got humiliated, but also how Herod is somewhat trapped in this system of power. He doesn't necessarily want to kill Herod, and yet he made this vow to the daughter: ask me for anything you wish. And he can't back down from that because of the rules of the game. He would be completely lowered in everybody's estimation if he backed down on his promise. And so because of the whole nature of the event as one that takes place in the seat of power, there is a sense of sadness that people are trapped in this system, which could be part of the kingdom that Mark wants us to see Jesus opposing. Next, the next woman we encounter is the Syrophoenician woman. And notice where the arrow comes here. Okay, Jesus has just had the time of healing and that feeding miracle, and another story on the lake. I forgot to mention that's also repeated in both. And he's gotten out of Jewish territory. He's gone up north, maybe for a breather. He's just had a conflict with religious leaders who've come out from Jerusalem to talk to him. And he's had a difference of opinion about the nature of, of keeping the law, and, and all these minute points of the law. The disciples weren't washing their hands enough or something like that. You can go back and read that. So it could be that Jesus is taking a break, but he encounters this Syrophoenician woman, and she has a daughter who is dying, who is not well, is possessed by a spirit. And she asked Jesus to heal her daughter. And how does Jesus respond? It doesn't sound very nice. Jesus repeats a common saying: you can't throw the child's bread to the dogs. Okay, the dogs is how people referred to Gentiles. And so it's been a conundrum for people to, first of all, people who want to save Jesus's reputation, very desperately tried, well, he didn't really mean it like that. Well, that gets you nowhere because it's very clear that yes, this is a racial slur that Jesus repeats. But even people, a lot of people also point to the fact that Jesus has just refuted the religious leaders about an issue of impurity. It's not what you eat. And that's the basic thing that separated the Jews from the Gentiles. That's why Jewish people couldn't associate with Gentiles, is because they ate the wrong foods. And Jesus has just declared all foods clean. Okay, so why is Jesus now taking this almost about turn? Jesus has actually also healed a Gentile previously with seemingly no qualms. So why is it a problem here? Now, the only way to get Jesus off the hook that I really kind of have an interest in is Elton Truebloods, who said, well, his book was called The Humor of Christ. the humor of Christ, and says, Jesus is bringing this up as a joke. You know, when she asked for him, well, you know what they say, you can't throw. And the woman gets the joke. She turns it around. She twists it around in her favor. She says, but even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the children's table. And Jesus says, because you have said this, go home, your daughter is healed. Now, you can't prove that how Jesus said it. So that's not an attempt to get Jesus, a surefire way to get Jesus off the hook. The important thing, the bottom line, is that to Mark, it doesn't matter. Jesus's reputation is not a concern here. Our author gives no effort to try to preserve Jesus's reputation. For all that we should care, Jesus was, most of his work had been done among Jews, and that's Jesus's mindset. And the critical thing, narratively speaking, if we're looking this as a story, as it is, and letting theology worry about itself, the important thing in this gospel is that Jesus, right from that's the demarcation, right in between that Galilean section and the Gentile section, is this woman's miracle, the healing of her daughter. It's this woman that changes Jesus's direction. And some people, just as strongly as I lifted up the woman last week, lift up this woman as a pivotal character in Mark's gospel. That regardless of what Jesus's intention was, Mark allows us to see this woman in this role of determining the next phase of Jesus's ministry and the opening of this kingdom to all. Some people call this miracle story a living parable. In other words, Jesus has just had this conflict with the scribes, and that's just in the chapter just before this, or the section of the chapter just before this, the beginning of the 7. This conflict with the scribes and other leaders from Jerusalem over the law, and what makes you clean or unclean. And now Jesus is performing a miracle for not only this unclean woman, but then another series of others, and repeats the feeding story. So this critical story is a parable, kind of living out the argument that Jesus had. Other people call attention to the fact that people studying the structure, the narrative structure, like we did with minute detail in the story about the woman who anoints Jesus, doing that to this story reveals that it's in a chiasm. You walk in, instead of A, B, C, D, like we had in the other, this goes A, B, D, C, E, then D, C, B, A. We walk out again. And right in the middle at that position of the letter E is this woman's retort to Jesus. So the structure of the story highlights her words. So we have another woman in an important dramatic position in the gospel. And then we don't have any direct encounters with women until chapter 12, and that's the widow who gives her mite at the temple. Jesus says that it's all that she has. So he's calling attention to the fact that all these people giving their offerings into the temple, and this is for the upkeep of the temple, this woman has given more than anyone else, even though all she gives is 2 pennies. Are you're remembering the story? Okay, all right. Because I was thinking once I would just read all these stories out, and I've kind of decided not to take that time. I will when we get to the end. This giving everything that she has, put this alongside, on a clothesline with all little events. Put this story in your frame of reference with the woman who anoints Jesus just a little bit later. Okay. You see that similarity? That she kind of foreshadows this woman who gives her all by breaking the jar of ointment. Everything she spends on Jesus. And because somebody pointed out last week that kind of foreshadows Jesus's giving everything he has, this widow, in a sense, also then foreshadows Jesus's offering. But it's not so much Jesus praising what she did, as much as shaming the other people in the story. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had to live on." It's not that that's such a great idea to put everything you have to live on. And Jesus could be calling attention to the fact that that's a shameful thing. That offering is expected of somebody as poor as this woman. And they think, they prayed their offering in there. They think they're giving so much. When Jesus is flipping the equation, you're not getting really anything at all. And should anybody, Jesus does not have a high impression of the temple in the Gospel of Mark. What happens right immediately after the story? That's when the disciples say, they look up at the temple walls. Wow, look at the stones, look at these buildings. And Jesus says, you know what? One's not going to be left on another. And this is the time, 70 AD, when that came true. Another woman lifted up in a positive light. And that brings us to the story we dealt with last week, the woman who anoints Jesus, and who I consider critical. And we'll return her critical role again next week. But we'll move on to the last women mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. And these are the witnesses at the cross and the would-be evangelists. And because of 16:8 and the ending, you know why I call them would-be evangelists. When the Sabbath day was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus, anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tombs. I skipped over their reference in chapter 15. At the time of the crucifixion, this is before they go out to the tomb. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joses, and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. And then later it's mentioned, verse 47, that they observe where Jesus is being buried. Where did these women come from? They came from Galilee. Right? Why has Mark not mentioned them before? And someone Some will say, well, that's because Mark is uncomfortable talking about women followers, women disciples of Jesus. But then why lift them up as he seems to be doing here, as Mark seems to be doing here, or whoever Mark is? Quotation marks again around Mark. I think that Mark could be holding them in the wings up until now. We've seen Mark portray women in very positive light. And it would not be like him to shy away from the role as disciples. So I'm thinking that he's keeping them in the wings, so that, well, I'll tell you a little bit why. I think that could be equally the case. It is possible that Mark was uncomfortable with women followers, but I'm not sure. Others say, well, look at this. They're watching from a distance. It shows they don't want to get too close. On the other hand, it could be that's where women were expected to watch from in those days. They were and they're a lot closer to the cross than the male disciples are. If you noticed, the male disciples disappear in Gethsemane. They flee. And then only Peter comes back, and that's in the courtyard, and he denies Jesus 3 times, and then he's out of there. Okay, so these 3 women at the crucifixion are closer than, or not just these 3, it could be other women there also at the cross observing. The text does suggest that. But notice I said the 3. Mark does name 3 in a sense that could be because he's equating, he's drawing a parallel. We have general disciples, but then we have the 12 disciples, and then sometimes we have just Peter, James, and John who get singled out. So it could be that Mark is paralleling that with these women, giving them kind of equal status in our perception of them then. This is the first evidence of a tomb story. This is one other detail that might become important next week. We have record of people telling stories of Jesus's resurrection, of encountering the risen Christ. Before the appearance of Mark's gospel, we have no evidence of a story about an empty tomb. And that's kind of significant. So keep that in the back of your mind. Now, I added a 4th arrow here in between the anointing and these women who show up at the cross and go later to the tomb to anoint Jesus. Does anybody know of any female character that I left out who comes in there? It's the servant girl who accuses Peter of being a follower of Jesus. I decided that since Peter is the main character of that story, that I wouldn't count her, but I later have changed my my opinion that that her stature as a servant, and I don't know exactly how old we are to figure her, but her role as somebody without a whole lot of power is able to shut Peter up. Peter cowers in front of her. It's not a Roman soldier. It's not a Jewish temple leader who's confronting Peter. It's a servant girl, and still he cowers. So she could still have that an important role. There are a couple other instances that I think we must call attention to that don't involve direct encounters between Jesus and women. I put across at two different other places, way back here in Galilee. Right after those series of confrontation stories where it shows that people are already plotting to kill Jesus, we have another confrontation between scribes and Pharisees that's placed inside a trip that Jesus's family makes to Jesus. They want to take care of him. They want to get him out of the way because they're afraid of what he's doing. He's being too controversial. People are saying that he has a demon, they don't want that. So the way Mark tells it, he sandwiches that the story about Beelzebul, who is in Jesus? Is it a demon? He sandwiches that in between the arrival of Jesus's family. His mother and brothers are mentioned, and Jesus's response. They finally come in or make themselves known at the end of that story, and Jesus ignores them. Jesus says, "Who are my mother and brothers?" Those who do the work of this kingdom I'm preaching, those who do the will of God are my mothers and brothers, and he adds sisters. Now, some later texts also put in sisters, include sisters in with the arrival of the mother and the brothers. Not all the texts do. Most, I think, would leave them out. Most scholars, I think, would probably leave them out and say that sisters was added in there because Jesus brings up sisters. We won't settle the question of whether Jesus actually had sisters or not, but it's important to know that our author wants us to know that Jesus is including sisters along with brothers. In other words, in a day and age where it was very common to let men also refer to women, like the feeding stories usually do that, 5,000 men. Jesus has included the word sisters. Then the other is the teaching on divorce. Are we supposed to end at 2:30 again? I'm lost again. Yeah. We're done. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. I couldn't read my clock last week. I'm having trouble again. Jesus brings up divorce and says, no divorce. I'm going to be very abbreviated here. But he makes an error of fact when he talks about it with his disciples. He says, he refers back to Genesis, first of all, and says, God created male and female. In our image, God created male and female for each other. And for this reason, a man leaves his mother and father's house and joins to his wife. And then he later says, if a man divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery against his wife. And then if the wife divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery against her husband. Couldn't happen that way. Women were not allowed to divorce. Women did not have the legal right to divorce in Jewish law. Roman law they did, but it was a whole separate category, different procedure. They were not treated as equal under the Roman law either. Jesus is treating them both equally here. If you had sex with somebody other than your wife and she was not married, you did not commit adultery. You cannot commit adultery against your wife in Jewish law of the day. If you had sex with a woman who was married to somebody else, you committed adultery, yes, but it was adultery against that man, the other woman's husband. A man can commit adultery against another man. A man does not commit adultery against his wife because the wife was considered property. Jesus ignores that and is talking about women in the same legal, with the same legal status of men. In other words, removing them from that status of property. Some people call attention to that. Not everybody does. Elizabeth Fiorenza says that reverting back to Genesis, Jesus is showing that patriarchy was not God's intent. Divorce in Jesus's day served patriarchy. It served men. It did not serve women. Today, we see a lot of women divorcing for the sake of their protection. That was not the issue here. Patriarchy served men, and Jesus is calling that into question. So, at the very least, I want to say that you cannot call our author misogynist, because these are some of the things that you would not find in a misogynist gospel. Okay. The other thing I want to call attention to is that often when women are highlighted, it's at the expense of men. You know, in contrast to somebody else. Like the Syrophoenician woman understands where Jesus is going with inclusion of Gentiles. If we kept on reading, we'd find out that the disciples are confused about that. They don't quite get it, like the woman does. The widow is lifted up in opposition to others. The woman who anoints Jesus, you know, is lifted up. Jesus treats her differently rather than the harsh treatment she gets from the men who are in attendance, because they don't get what she gets. The servant girl, even the servant girl knows that Peter is Jesus's disciple. Peter doesn't seem to know that. She is giving him an opportunity to hold true to his promise that he would be faithful to Jesus. Okay. And then the women at the tomb, you know, we don't know. Some people argue about whether they're going there to anoint Jesus because Jesus's corpse, or whether they're expecting him to be risen. But we don't have to settle that. They're at least going to attend to Jesus. Whereas, remember back at the death of John, the disciples of John took the corpse and they buried him. The disciples of Jesus are gone, right? So there's that it's not just that women are mentioned, but they're mentioned because of the failures, calling attention to the failures of men, or at least of others. It's important to note here, we've had tunnel vision. There are a lot of men that Jesus responds to positively, and that a lot of men like Bartimaeus and possibly even Joseph of Arimathea, who are lifted up as positive role models of faith. So it's not a clear men versus women. It's not a clear gender bifurcation here that I'm suggesting. But what I think we do see, represented by this blue decrescendo mark, is that the 12 who started out, and as a narrative, the narrative invites us to identify with the 12 disciples. Historically, we want to do that, you know, all that. They come up, they do well on their mission and things like that. But over time, we see them crashing. They're less and less aware of what Jesus is doing, and they're making more and more mistakes till we get down to the end. They're gone. They have not perceived what Jesus is trying to teach in these 3 sessions along the way to Jerusalem, and they end up disappearing from the story. Whereas women, even though they've always been presented in a positive light, except for that one instance, we see at least the narrative building up their potential, their hope, so that when we notice the disciples when we're worried that they're going to not come through, suddenly these women disciples appear, you know, at the cross. Aha, maybe they are going to save the day. So we see a crescendo mark in the form of the women, but it all falls down here at the end. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So this is the part of Mark that has received the most attention. It's the most puzzling, and it's what my thesis next week is going to address. What do we do with those women who I suggest, and other people too, that Jesus is that our author is presenting them in a positive light. They are potentially the hope, and yet they fail too. Now, some scholars, some feminists, and even other scholars have tried to excuse their behavior by saying that the fear that they have is a positive fear, describing it somehow in a positive light. That it's the fear, it's like the trance that someone goes into before something good happens. They refer to some other occurrences in the Bible where that happens. And others say, well, it's a temporary fear. Just like Jesus told some people to be silent, and they went out and told anyway, that these women are going to do the same thing. Or that their silence is just to the general public. There was one instance where Jesus healed somebody, and he told them to be silent, but then go tell the authorities, present yourself as healed. And so their silence was qualified. Well, that means that the women were, all of these kind of fall short in most people's, at least in mine. They don't quite work. One woman is even more drastic, and it turns Jesus into the bad guy. And I don't see how that is very likely in the good news of Jesus Christ, that Jesus lets these women down because their fear is because, oh, we didn't know that Jesus is going to Jerusalem to meet with the disciples. We've been left out. You know, that's another feminist approach to this ending that I've encountered, but that has its problems too. A lot of people just say that our gospel is leaving both men and women potentially failures, and that puts the burden on us. Okay, we could also fail too if we're not careful. Some form of that. I have a different alternative understanding of the end that I've not heard anybody address yet, at least in my research. And I have to let it wait till next week, not just because of time, not just because I want to leave you on clinging on a cliff, but because you can see all of these possible solutions to this abrupt ending get us at least putting our toe, if not wading, into Mark's purpose and what's going on that could cause Mark to be writing in the way he does. A strict narrative scholar does not need to delve into that purpose, but just analyze what's here. Just what's here is kind of unsettling. You know, we don't like stories, even though some stories do end abruptly, we don't really like it. So to go beyond this point, we need a little bit more, we need to back up a little bit more and talk about some potential purposes that people present for Mark, and put the story in the context of the day, not only Jesus's day, but the day of the church that first encountered this gospel. So I hope that you will come back as we delve into that. And maybe not tidy anything up, but at least come to a larger understanding of what possibly our author is up to, and what could be behind the whole gospel, and also this particular ending. So
Philip has given us, I don't think I'm on. Delay?
Yes.
I don't see any light.
I think that we are opening up for questions, but we have a problem with the microphone that
Okay,
gets
I'll be
handed
in.
out here.
Can we get on? Yep. There's no switch.
There we go.
There's a
Now we're
switch.
on.
Oh. So we got a few minutes. Philip gave us a lot. I can show you've been taking notes, so if you have any comments or questions to bring to the table, we've got one right here, Pamela.
So Phil, what's our preparation for next week?
Okay, to prepare for next week, you could always, as I suggested, read the gospel through again. There are some, if you can get yourself to either the college library or the seminary library, I doubt if Herrick would have any of the books that I listed there, but you could find those. But just live with that ending for a bit, read it every day. And what does this do to me? What does this do to me to find out that the male disciples are left, they've left the story, and the women are silent at the end.
All right, we got another one here.
Maybe I just, because we've had so much emphasis on the women, maybe I've missed out on other aspects of it.
Mhm.
But it seems to me that at least a couple of these women had more true faith or understanding in Jesus than some of the men who were healed. Who, in many of those cases with the men, they were part of a large group, and oh, this prophet is here, and I go there and touch his robe, or he puts his hands on me, I'll be healed. But are those individuals truly understanding who he is?
Yeah.
Especially the woman who anointed him. I feel, truly have
Right.
understanding.
Okay.
Gotta repeat
Do the men that I've lost faith in my clock here. So someone's got to tell me where we're at.
Yeah, we got time.
Okay. The question had to do with, are the men who are healed in Jesus, do they show as much understanding as the women do? And my first reaction is, we'll look at Bartimaeus. He seems to be lifted up as a model of faith. He crosses a boundary. He takes the initiative, just like the woman who reaches after the garment does. He cries out all the longer when people are ignoring him. And he wants to see. He wants to understand. He doesn't want to sit by the roadside, for the rest of his life. There's a Roman officer that Jesus performs a miracle for, that Jesus called, in all of Israel, I've not seen greater faith. So I would say that yes, that the issue is not that women get it and men don't. The issue more is the disciples don't seem to get it. The 12 don't seem to get it. And the women do seem to get it, at least until the end. So.
All right, we have time for about, wait for the microphone.
Oh, yes. Okay, I was getting close to the question. Sorry about you folks at home. I know that you're there, and I'm happy you're there. I was getting right.
You're withdrawing your comment?
I am, yes.
All right. Anyone else have a comment or a question? We have time.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I know that was covered a lot of territory. And so you may, if you read through the gospel in one sitting, you notice it didn't take all that long. You may want to do it again and let some of these things fall into place and try to see some of those structural things that I called attention to. If you are looking for something to do to prepare for next week. Otherwise, just come back and your response to my thesis will be appreciated. So.
Susan, do we have any comments from the Zoom crowd?
We do not currently have anything in the chat.
Okay, all right.
got another comment over here. Hang on.
Okay, thanks. So David, if you're going to close the class, the microphone that you're using actually can't be heard outside of the classroom. So you might want to walk up towards Phil.
Right.
Okay.
I just have one comment. And it's based on just my
Mhm.
perception of what you've been teaching. And I have so much that you have offered to think about. And I keep going back to the chapter 8, verse 16 through 19. And it almost reminds me of the prayers that all the pastors I've ever been around when they pray before the beginning of their message, of their sermon, where they ask that we keep our eyes open and our ears open, and that we ask that our hearts and our minds be open so that we might hear and understand.
Hmm.
And that's basically what he is throwing back at the disciples when they fail to understand, and I'm trying to understand because you've given us a lot of things to think about. Thank you.
Okay, the comment was that that there was a lot of material presented, but it gives us something to think about, and that's exactly what Jesus is doing with the disciples. And you're referring to Jesus said, "Why are you talking about having no bread?" You know.
Yeah, they don't understand.
Okay, and then rehearsing that with them. Yeah, that sometimes it takes some living with the experience. That Jesus is asking a lot of the disciples, and maybe that's one of the purposes of this gospel is to get us doing that same kind of wrestling. Not if the disciples get it in the end, we might say, "Hey, the story's done. It's over." If the disciples don't get it at the end of the gospel, it might make it more important to us to jump into their task, what they were commissioned to do, and say, what do we need to do to get it? Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's
Well, your
okay.
mic and- Thank you all for being here. Oh, we have one more comment, so let me get that, but thank you for being here, and we'll see you all next week, and hang on for one more comment.
I have a question about, were there ever any theoretical treaties on what they thought Christ did from the time he was in the temple until he went out at 30 and started preaching?
Oh, yeah, now you're kind of jumping in the Gospel of Luke there. Yes, a lot of people have questioned about that and written about it. She's wondering about what happened between Jesus at 12 in the temple and the time he begins his ministry. And yes, the quick answer is yes. Some people have him going to India. That's just the extreme, but I can't tell you more than that. I can't evaluate that particularly. Just like we don't like abrupt endings, we don't like those kind of gaps either. And so people kind of fill in, but we aren't going to address that. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'll call you. I'll tell you where you can find some of that stuff.
Well, thank you all. See you next week.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, everyone at home. I'm going to go ahead and close the class. We'll see you next time.